This is Q&A, boys and girls. So, who's up?
About 2 or 3 weeks ago, Rabbi asked you about the validity of the oral code, or proofs for the validity about the oral code. And you gave me a few points. So basically, right now, I would like to ask about the part from Moses to the Mishnah that Rabbi wrote the Mishnah. So I'm asking whether you have any leads for how to validate this period that negate a case of a telephone chain or a telephone chain. Yes, that's my question. What was the shita, their shita for preserving the information, and if today we have evidence for this.
Okay, so we're talking about the reliability of transmitting the oral information that Moses taught the people. And you're asking about the period from the time of Moses until the Mishnah,
Yes.
which is about 1,500 years. Well, let's start externally. We have an enormous amount of evidence from the time of the Mishnah down to the present, because we have a lot of recorded sources. You don't expect radical changes in the character and abilities of a culture in a short period of time. I think it would be unacceptable to say, until the Mishnah, it was haphazard, nobody kept records, nobody cared whether they got it right or not, different things came in at different times, and then there was a revolution, and the whole culture changed its character, and all of a sudden, they became very committed to this and very good at it. So the general cultural stability would indicate that if you have of a period of about 2,000 years where you know there was very great stability, that already is evidence that before that there was stability. Otherwise, you'd be postulating a radical cultural change. And changes like that don't happen in cultures, number one. Number two, the Mishnah was a composition of an official document for what we call the oral tradition. And the reason the Mishnah was created was because it was being forgotten to an extent that they thought was dangerous to understanding and preserving the tradition. Always things were forgotten. No time did we have perfect memory. Nobody claims that. In fact, the things were forgotten in the days when Moses died. But the amount of it that could threaten the continuity of the main understanding, that threat was what motivated writing the Mishnah, or composing the Mishnah. Some say the Mishnah wasn't written down, it was just composed. But okay, composing the Mishnah. Now let's just use some contrapositive reasoning. If at this time they wrote it down because of the threat of forgetting, it must follow that at previous times there wasn't a threat of forgetting, because if there had been times previous where there was a threat of forgetting, they would have composed the Mishnah at that time. Composing the Mishnah is a strategy that is within the tradition. It's within the hands of the tradition. So if they used it at one time and not a prior time, it follows the prior time it wasn't needed. It would be like saying, how do you know he wasn't deathly ill 2 years before he got the medication? And the answer is because they didn't give them the medication 2 years before. Because we have been 2 years ill 2 years before, they would have given the medication 2 years earlier. So the very fact that we were able to compose the Mishnah to preserve the oral tradition against forgetting, when there was a danger of forgetting, means that earlier to that, there wasn't such a danger of forgetting. Number 3, if you take a look at the oral tradition that is preserved in the Mishnah. So there are lots of disagreements in the Mishnah. How wide are the disagreements? How fundamental are the disagreements? And what kind of subjects do they disagree? You know that there are branches of Christianity that have their holidays on different dates. The Eastern Orthodox have a different date for the winter holiday and a different date for the spring holiday. They have a different calendar. Do we have 2 different calendars? Does the Mishnah record 2 different calendars? Take the categories of things that are forbidden on Shabbos. How many disagreements are there about what categories there are and what they mean? If the sum total information is 100, then the disagreements are about 6. 94% is agreed upon. The text of the Torah, do we have different books that claim to be the Torah with different texts, different verses, different chapters? No. So it means the Mishnah is recording the information they had at that time, and it was very uniform. If it wasn't preserved before then, why weren't there many, many more open disagreements? And even where logic would imply the appropriateness of a disagreement. I'll give you an example that I have from a good friend of mine who isn't in this world anymore. We have two laws about mixing things. One is milk and meat, and the other is linen and wool in garments. The verse that prohibits milk and meat is, don't cook the meat of an animal in its mother's milk. That is a very narrow description. This meat in the milk of its mother. That's not how we understand the law. The law has any kosher meat and any kosher milk. So it's an extremely specific verse, generalized to a much, much greater field of application. Now the Torah says, don't put linen and wool together in garments. Well, let's see. Linen is a vegetable product. It's a plant. And wool comes from sheep, from animals. Wouldn't it be natural to say linen is only an example of vegetation, and wool is only an example of an animal substance? And what it really means is, don't combine vegetative products with animal products. So don't use cotton thread in leather. Of course, cotton comes from a plant and leather comes from an animal. No one ever dreamt of doing that. No such opinion has been heard in 3,300 years of Jewish history. Now, if you're not preserving it carefully and people aren't paying attention, and there are influences from India and from Persia, and you're going in the desert and you change it for the desert and so forth and so on, it's all haphazard. Why didn't somebody say, just like in milk and meat, with a very narrow verse, you generalized it to the whole category? So here too, with linen and wool, we'll talk about all plant substances with all animals, but nobody ever dreamt of it. And nobody ever said with milk and meat that it's only what the verse says, that it should be the meat in its mother's milk. Why didn't that get confused? Why weren't there other opinions which saw it differently? Obviously, we're talking about what the Mishnah received now. This is your period from Moses down to the Mishnah, right? If it wasn't preserved carefully and accurately, why aren't there much wider disagreements about the way in which these things should be done? Especially when the verses give you almost no clue what to do, and it's all oral. Tefillin, you saw that in the book, everybody mentions this. Tefillin, Torah says bind words on your hand. You cannot bind words on your hand. Words are abstract. So it means some kind of physical thing. Well, there are 1,000 things your memory, your imagination could make up, and there's only one way of doing it. We have film going back thousands of years, and archaeologically, and there's no other thing, and there's no other view. We have lots of different disagreements about various subjects, but not subjects as widespread as that. And esrog, the Torah doesn't use the word esrog; it calls it pri eitz hadar. Pri eitz hadar is ambiguous. It means what is hadar? The pri or the eitz? Pri hadar mi eitz or pri me eitz shehu hadar. Right? You could read it either way. Right? Does that tell you which species it is? The only disagreement in the history of Judaism is that maybe lemons are also. Not only an esrog, but a lemon. But not an orange and not a grape and not a fig and nothing. No, why not? If the information wasn't preserved accurately, this is oral since Moses. For 1,500 years. You would expect different groups to have different traditions. Even the Essenes and the Sadducees and all the rest of them didn't disagree about this. They didn't say you should take a papaya for the Pri Eitz Hadar. So obviously this information was being kept extremely well.
Rabbi, how come you're saying it's all from Moses? Because we know what was written at some of the time the Mishnah was written. We don't know what happened, like whether there were disagreements beforehand.
Yeah,
are there evidence that there weren't? I don't know, like, because it's thousands of years.
This is not the question we started with. The question we started with was preserving the oral tradition from Moses until the Mishnah. That was the question. So that assumes there was something that Moses told them, something, and we agreed there must be something, because otherwise you couldn't understand what was written. The question is how well it was preserved. Yeah. Well, if it wasn't preserved, then what happened? It means people forgot, people misunderstood, people had different opinions, different things came in from the outside. Why wasn't it preserved? These are the reasons why information gets lost in normal human groups. But when that happens, you end up with lots of groups and lots of different opinions about the same subject. Like, let's say you have in America today. Lots of different groups. Some will tell you this history is true, and some will tell you it's false. Some will tell you it happened this way, some will tell you that way. You have groups who think that Socrates was black. You have all different kinds of groups, right? So if the preservation was not good, that information that Moses gave should have splintered into a lot of different groups with a lot of different opinions. Now you're talking about from Moshe to the Mishnah. So I'm saying, let's think what's recorded in the Mishnah. What's recorded in the Mishnah is the information that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his Beit Din received. So where are all these disagreements that should have crept into the information if it was not preserved correctly? You don't have the result of breakdown that you're wondering whether it happened or not. The result of breakdown would be information in a certain state, and it's not in that state. It never was in that state. So I think that all the evidence that we have, without knowing internally what the mechanisms were, I'm looking externally at the product, right? It's like a black box. I know what the product is. The product is not the product of a confused and forgotten and interrupted tradition, because if it were so, it wouldn't look the way it looks. That's direct evidence.
We have for the internal evidence for the mechanism, or we don't have?
Well, it's famously the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, the Rambam says that everyone had the right to make his own notes. It wasn't forbidden for a person to write down his notes. And the Gemara mentions several times what they call Megillas Sesorim, which means a hidden scroll. And they quote laws from a hidden scroll. So the Rambam says these were the private notes of a particular scholar, which he wasn't allowed to make into an official text for the group, but he kept his own notes. And the Gemara quotes it in several places. But before that, indeed, it was oral. There was a certain purpose in keeping it oral. And until the danger of collective forgetting set in, and when was the Mishnah written? The Mishnah was written about 100 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, when the Jewish people were scattered, when there wasn't a central authority in the land of Israel and to make decisions. The Sanhedrin itself was in Gullus, at that time, and so he couldn't make certain types of decisions altogether. And the exile, unlike the Babylonian exile, was only 70 years. It was already more than 100 years, and there was no recovery in sight. So the conditions for preserving it looked much weaker to them, and that's why they started to. They started by writing the Mishnah, and of course, it was supplemented by the Gemara. But at any rate, the question you asked about that period, all the evidence that we have indicates a reasonably stable tradition. Again, no one's claiming that nothing was ever forgotten. We even have statements in the Talmud that this and this was forgotten. So we know something's true, but it was stable enough not to require any special means to preserve it. And all the evidence we have is that's true. Yeah, was noch. You're here to watch the fun, which is okay. I don't mind. You have another question? Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, the people that wrote the Mishnah didn't have Semicha because they weren't outside of Israel.
No, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was in Israel. He was here in Sipori. He and his Beit Din were here in Sipori.
So he wrote and compiled the
That's right.
Mishnah inside Israel, and he had Semicha.
Yeah, but having Smicha wouldn't make any difference. Half of the Amoraim didn't have Smicha. Smicha was the ability to sit in a court and decide a decision for two litigants who came and make a binding decision.
Isn't it the authority to pass the oral code to the next generation?
Sure, that was just knowledge.
Sorry?
That was just knowledge.
Yeah, but isn't having Smicha is the authority to pass the oral code, like to pass the oral code to the next generation?
No,
Okay.
no, not at all. Not at all. That's just knowledge. You're talking about making decisions to change it or to add to it. That's something else. But to just pass it down that this is what the oral tradition teaches? Of course not. We haven't had Smicha in 1,600 years. We've been passing it down for 1,600 years.
It's a question in itself.
But it isn't, because no one recognizes any difficulty in it. No one ever raised the question. The last 1,600 years, there's no oral tradition because there was no smicha. They're not connected. Rav didn't get smicha until he went to Bavel. He was going to Bavel, and he had certain roles he had to play there, public roles of making decisions for the community. So he worked on getting smicha. Until then, when he was in Eretz Israel, he didn't have smicha. What did he need it for? He was a teacher of Torah. The Torah is passed down by teachers of Torah.
But who were the people that allowed to teach us? I thought it's people that had smicha.
You're thinking like rabbinical ordination. You know, you don't have to have rabbinical ordination to teach Torah. Half of the Amoraim did not have rabbinical ordination, and they are our Amoraim. They are our greatest sages. Their opinions are authoritative because the Talmud is authoritative. Having smicha was a functional status for the community. You wanted to make a bezdin and you wanted to make a decision that would be binding on the community, you had to have smicha.
So I understood also that if there were controversies, then there was like voting, right? Vote and then
In the Sanhedrin.
Yes, and okay.
And all the people in the Sanhedrin had smicha. That's right. All 71 of them had smicha. 71 out of 10,000 scholars, 71 had smicha. Absolutely.
So smicha is a necessity part, as I understood, like the mechanism of passing the oral code orally without any mistakes.
Not true.
So,
Not true. First of all, a person with smicha could make mistakes, and the Sanhedrin could make mistakes. We don't hold the Sanhedrin was infallible. The Ran has a whole drasha on this. They're human beings. They're human beings. They're human beings. What do you have in the Gemara when one of the Amoraim says, I made a mistake? What do you do then?
Vote with other Amoraim.
No, he says he made a mistake. He says about himself he made a mistake.
Okay.
He said, I made a mistake.
Okay.
Did he make a mistake?
If he said so.
Better than that, because maybe the second one is wrong and the first one was right. But one of them is wrong. We're not trusting his second judgment more than his first judgment, right? But one of them is wrong. They themselves said they made mistakes. That didn't mean they weren't able to pass down the Masorah. Semicha has nothing to do with passing down the Masorah. It has to do with making new decisions about the Masorah, applying the Masorah in a way that the community has to follow, but not passing it down. Nothing to do with it.
So, I'm a little bit new to this. For majority of the Torah, or like the beginning part of it, being Jewish is passed down through the patriarch. And I know that at some point it switches to a matriarch line. I have a lot of friends that back in America that are Jewish on their father's side but not on their mother's side, and they know a lot more than I do, but they haven't gone through like a conversion process or anything like that. But I know that that doesn't make them Jewish. So why did it switch to being through the matriarch? And even though the majority of of the founders were it was through the patriarch.
So first of all, what you're stating as the fact to be explained is not agreed upon. There are those who say that even before the Torah was given, Jewish identity was passed down by the mother, not the father. There's a question of the extent to which the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, up until the giving of the Torah, have the status of Jews or not. Non-Jewish national identity is passed down by the father, from the father. Some say that the Jews, before the giving of the Torah, were like the other nations of the world, and their identity was passed down through the father, and some say it was passed down through the mother. That they had that characteristic of Jewish identity even then. The authority for the change is based on an explicit verse where the Gemara takes it. The verse says, I'm paraphrasing, it says, don't have your children intermarry with non-Jews. Don't take a non-Jewish woman for your son, and don't take a non-Jewish man for your daughter. Because he will turn him against me. He will turn him against me. Who's he? Who's him? Well, the Gemara says, the Gemara takes it understands like this. You're taking a non-Jew to your house. A non-Jew in your house is going to have a bad effect. I guess it's the son-in-law and not the daughter-in-law that's going to do it. Now, he will turn him. Who's the him? Him is the child. The child. Okay. So now that means it's the non-Jewish son-in-law who's going to turn the grandchild against God. That grandchild's mother is the Jewish daughter. And that's what we're worried about. We're worried about the son-in-law turning the Jewish daughter's son or child against God. Which means that the product of that union, the non-Jewish son-in-law and the Jewish daughter, is a Jew who might be turned against God. What about the other way? What about the non-Jewish daughter-in-law who married the Jewish boy, and they'll have a child? You told me the daughter-in-law can't influence her child? Can't have an effect on her child? The answer is, sure she can, but he's not Jewish because his mother's not Jewish. And that's why Sam says, I'm not commanding you to worry about whether she will turn her child who's not Jewish against me. I'm telling you to worry about his turning your daughter's child against me who's Jewish. That's where they have the source for the fact that it goes after the mother. Okay. So now you ask me why, since it's an explicit verse, you're really asking me, why did God do that? No. I don't know how much we know. I don't have encyclopedic knowledge of the Torah. I'll tell you one suggestion, however, that's wrong. The suggestion is, you know who the mother is. Often enough, you don't know who the father is. But that's got to be a wrong explanation, because the Mashiach has to be Ben Achaben from King David, father's line only. And it's pretty important to know who the Messiah is, I think. I think it's a pretty important thing to make available for common knowledge, right? And if we really were in doubt as to who's father, and we only could verify who's mother, we would never know who the Messiah is. So it doesn't sound like that was the problem. That sounds to me like not a plausible explanation. One can speculate the preservation of the Jewish people, the salvation of the Jewish people from crisis situations has most often, most consistently been women rather than men. So you see in practical action, whether it was the golden calf, which the women did not participate in, or the rebellion of the spies, which the women did not participate in, and the women did not die in the wilderness. They didn't die. They all went into the land of Israel. Only the men died. Or whether it was when Sarah told Abraham, get rid of Yishmael. He can't be in the house. He can't inherit you. And Abraham didn't want to do it, but God confirmed Sarah and said, yes, you have to get rid of him. Or whether it was Isaac who wanted to give a blessing to Esau, and Rebekah said, no, you can't do that. And God engineered it, that she was the one who was right and not he. This preserving of the Jewish people, there's a Talmud that says that in the merit of the righteous women in Egypt, that's why that generation was saved from Egypt, because of the women. Men are not mentioned, just the women. So you see a consistent line of women being responsible for the preservation of the Jewish people. So if you want that as a symptom of the fact that they're the ones who have this determining factor, you could see it as a symptom. I wouldn't say it's a cause or an explanation, but it's a symptom. But beyond that, those are the Kodesh Baruch Hu's calculations. Yeah.
In a recent Q&A, someone asked you about sports, and you mentioned that it can, for example, foster a competitive characteristic in a person. But then you finished, you said, but a person does need to relax in some ways. So what would be a 100% kosher way to relax?
Well, there's a lot of exercises that people do, including strength exercises, running outside or running on a treadmill.
What if it's more of like a mental way to relax?
Well, I know people who relax running. I mean, the rhythm of the running, and you get into a rhythm where your body's functioning like a machine. I was a runner, so and it's almost semi-hypnotic. You just let the machine run, and you sort of float along. Some people find it that way. So I guess it would depend upon what you do. I know people who do rowing. I know people who lift weights. There are also things you can do that aren't competitive, except competing against yourself. You want to do better than you did last time, but you're not competing against other people.
Do you have other ideas besides exercise?
Oh, besides exercise, you started with exercise. Oh, well, that depends upon the person. For me, certain types of classical music are tremendously relaxing. You have to choose carefully, because some classical music is so engaging and involving that you can't. You're riveted. I am anyway. But a lot of Mozart is very relaxing. Handel's relaxing. These are things which are semi-repetitive and smooth and pleasant sounds. Probably different instrumentation. Some people like string quartets or piano trios. I think are delightful. Beethoven's piano trios are really delightful. You wouldn't know that Beethoven wrote them. they're kind and they're gentle and they're relaxing, and so nature. Some people find walking in a forest very relaxing. I think it'll depend, some types of literature, some types of poetry for some people. I think it'll vary for the person. I don't think there's this single, or creative activity. If you like to draw, you like to paint, that can be nerve-wracking or it can be very relaxing. Especially if you're talented. Even drawing people. I see people toss off sketches, And since they know how to do it and they're confident of their skill, so they're not worried about failing or worried about the quality, and they're just doing it to express, their creativity. So I think it would vary very greatly with the person. For some people, just reading biographies can be very inspiring and could also be relaxing. That person has to find for himself what's good for him.
Other parts of the Torah that are actually oral today?
Yes. Are there parts of the Torah that are oral today? Yeah, but it's tricky. For example, Rav Yaakov Hillel writes in one of his Sfarim, those who wrote books about Kabbalism put mistakes in the books on purpose, so you could identify somebody who learned it from a book, because that person is suspect. He didn't have a teacher. He didn't have somebody watching him and evaluating him and guiding him. That's suspect. That's something that's very difficult to trust. Kabbalah is supposed to be a development of the spirit. If you didn't have a teacher watching him, then you have to be worried. So they put mistakes in the books so you could tell, aha, he got it from a book because he made that mistake.
Why worry? Why this necessity of having a rabbi? Even if one can get the information without it.
Well, this is a deep question. Let's see if I can start to. Well, why have a teacher, a rabbi, as a teacher, if you can get the information, let's say from a book? Let's say you have a great book put out by a great author. Somebody tells you, he worked very hard on this book, and he wrote it several times. He made a lot of changes. Would you like to see some of the drafts and the changes he made? Would that be interesting?
As a reader?
As a reader, as a thinker, as a person who wants to understand the world, a person who wants to be inspired.
Maybe I want to understand his methodology of writing, if it's so great. Why not?
Oh, and maybe you get more than the methodology of writing. You might get his methodology of thinking. He first wrote this, then he crossed it out, and he wrote this instead. Now suppose you saw that 16 times. Aha, it wasn't precise enough. Because in 13 out of the 16, what he did is he made it more precise. So you see, he was working hard for precision. So precision was hard for him. You wouldn't learn something from that?
It's a great lesson.
Definitely. And what about music? You go to a concert. Would you like to attend a rehearsal?
If I'm interested in the process of making a great music piece.
Your mind is too narrow. You want to understand the music. You want to understand the performance. When you see an object and it was chosen out of 6, you know a lot more than thinking that it was the only one. You're not learning how to choose. You're not learning how to choose. You're learning what makes this one great. You see the other 5, you compare it with the 5, and you see that he chose, not because you want to choose, not because you want to learn how to choose. You want to learn what's great about this one here, this one that you're seeing. You'll never choose, but you're learning more about this one because this one was chosen against those 5. You learn more about it when you know the process by which it is produced. So, when you study from a teacher, you hear him. If the teacher just reads lectures, he just reads the words from the lectures and goes home, then that wouldn't count. But in our teaching circumstance, that isn't it. He says, questions are asked, there's an argument, this one contradicts this one. You see his attitude? If his attitude says a stupid question, that's very different from it being a serious question. You learn something, what's important to his thought process, what's important to the project that he's trying to produce. You learn a great deal more from interacting with a live teacher than you do from reading from a book. And that without taking into account that he'll see you. Not that you will see him, but he sees you. When you ask a question, there's a difference between what you say and what you mean. Often you think, I shouldn't have said that. That's not what I meant. Those words weren't the right words. A teacher can see what you mean because he knows you. I'll tell you, I used to go to Manchester, England, and Bamberger there, it says the Daf Yomi Shir. His profession is to say the Daf Yomi Shir 3 times a day. That's all he does. He's paid by the community to say the Daf Yomi Shir. When I went, the one that I went to was at 6 a.m. I went with my balabas, who always went, and he was marvelous. He had Shas under total control. Total control. I asked him questions. He always answered my question. He got to the point where if I raised my hand, he could tell me what question I was going to ask. And he was always right. Because he understood me. He understood where I'm coming from. He understood what I know, what I don't know. He understood what interested me. So when I raised my hand, he said, you want to ask this? And he was always right. So to interact with a teacher who knows you that well, who can be mat'im, his answer to your state of knowledge and information, your state of understanding, and your state of maturity is a tremendous gift. You don't get that from a book. So all of this is part of what you, not to mention, inspiration from seeing the teacher. I heard, I can't remember, 100, 200 shiurim from Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik. And in the summers, he used to teach for 8 weeks, I was in the Boston area, so I used to go 3 to 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, Gemara. There were about 20 who came up from New York and 20 from the Boston area, so about 40 of us there. And I saw him struggle with a sugya. I saw him struggle. This revolving genius, gigantic genius, knew Kol Torah Kula. And by the way, in his spare time, as gravel on the way to the front door, he happened to have a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin. And to see him struggling with the sugya and rejecting answers on the grounds that they didn't fit the language or they didn't fit the logic, and see him not win the struggle, that's to say, not come out with a conclusion. And one summer, we were learning Horius, and by the end of 6 weeks, we got to Daf Zion, I think, and he said, we only have 2 weeks to go, we're not going to finish it, let's start again from the beginning. We started again from the beginning, and it came out all different. All different. That itself, you're not going to get that from a book. There's an enormous amount that you learn from. I'll tell you one other thing. Psak halacha. You have a question in halacha, and you need an answer. You don't know the literature well enough yourself, so you go to a human being, and he gives you an answer. Now let's suppose the question Hilchos Shabbos. Suppose you ask your question. He takes down the Mishnah Berurah and opens it up and reads to you the Mishnah Berurah. Has anything happened that you couldn't have happened if you had taken out the Mishnah Berurah at home and read the same words? Yes, because you're bound by his psak. And you're not bound by what you read in the Mishnah Berurah. Why not? It's the same words. But he heard your question. He answered your question. Mishnah Berurah wasn't written for you. It was written for the public. He answered you. When he answers you, even if he reads from the Mishnah Berurah, you're bound by his psak. Now let's understand, because people do have some funny ideas about this. Bound by a psak does not mean you can't go and ask again. That doesn't mean that. What it means is that when you go to ask another person, you have to tell them, I went to so-and-so, and I got this psak, and I want to ask you also. Then he can decide whether he wants to hear you. If he thinks maybe that the first one made a mistake, he could overrule him. But he has to know that you went to somebody else. It's a question of legal procedure. And sometimes these matters are quite subtle. I have a friend who was a Talmud of Moshe Halberstam, Zechazad Bracha. He sat by him for years and did shimush by him, and now he is involved in production of stam, and also he paskin shilas. He's very, very knowledgeable. He told me the following story. There was a boy, maybe he was an Ohr Somayach, and his parents were coming for Pesach. Parents were totally not from. So the boy has this problem. They're coming from the land, from America, where they keep 2 days in the beginning, 2 days at the end. They'll be in Eretz Yisrael, where everybody keeps 1 day. What should his parents do? So he went to a certain rabbi. He said, "What should my parents do?" And he said, "Parents have to keep 2 days." They're not going to want to keep 1 day. 2 days when nobody else is keeping 2 days. What am I going to do? So he came to Rav Moshe Halberstam, and he told him the story. Moshe Halberstam said, "The psak that rabbi gave you is not a psak. It's not a psak." So my friend said to me, "Can you figure out why I wasn't a psak?" I don't know. He's not living in Eretz Yisrael. Can he paskin for Eretz Yisrael? And tell him what to do, and so forth and so on. No. His parents didn't ask him to get a psak for them. He wasn't authorized to ask their question for them. So it's not a psak. The psak is about them, not about him. I thought, I wouldn't have thought of that. Right? Just a procedural problem, He wasn't the one for whom the question was being asked. And then he told them that they could keep 1 day. But there's a lot going on there. When you go to a human being, it takes into account a lot more than a book could take into account. Another story told me about Moshe Halberstam. On Tisha B'Av, supposed to fast for 25 hours. Well, different people, different ages, different medical conditions. There can be serious questions. And Rabbi always gets questions like all day long. So he was there when Rabbi Moshe Halberstam got a question from an older person who had various medical conditions. Rabbi Halberstam said, "I paskin that you should eat, and I'm not hanging up the phone till I hear the bracha." Because he knows what the guy's going to say. "Okay, it's 3 p.m, and the shkia is at 7 o'clock. I should eat. I'll eat at 4 o'clock. Let's see if I can make it. Do I really need to? I know what the rabbi said, but still, it's Tisha B'Av. How could I eat on Tisha B'Av?" So he said, "I'm not hanging up the phone till I hear the bracha." He knows he wouldn't make a bracha and not eat. No Jew would do that. So the bottom line is that there's a pasuk that says, "V'hoyu ro'echa ro'os esmorecha." Your eyes will see your teacher. Now, those who are clever know that Morech is written with a yud, and it's plural. It is plural, but in context it means a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Go look up the pasuk. And it means you'll see a Kodesh Baruch Hu teaching you, but he's called your teacher there. And from this they get a general value of being taught by a teacher and seeing the teacher. And one of the Tanoim said, "The reason I'm so great is because I learned from Rabbi Meir, and I was only zocheh to sit behind him, and had I learned from him face to face, I'd have been even greater." So there's a certain this you can't get from a book. Yeah.
You mentioned the psak could be binding to a degree. So there are times when you ask someone, a rabbi, a question, and you get an answer, but maybe you don't feel that he understood you, or that he took enough time, or that, sometimes you're trying to build a relationship, so you realize they can't really speak your language and understand you in that degree. So would you say a psak is binding in that regard as well, or would you say, how does a person trust his own sense of being understood when you could just not really like the psak and be lying to yourself? And
Okay, there are two things going on here. First of all, let's get the legal side straight. Binding is a relative term because you can always go to somebody else and tell them the whole story, and then he'll decide what to do about it. So it's not binding in the sense that you're not allowed to ask again. That's number one. But number two, the question of knowing whether this is the person that you want to be your posek. I think there we are perforce thrown back on our own judgment. I have a parallel for this. For the first 1,000 years of the existence of the Jewish people, we had prophecy, and there were so many prophets that everyone was in touch with the prophet. Everyone could ask prophets his questions. Right? So if there was something about what I need to do, how I should do this mitzvah, or what I should do tshuva for, or where I should put my emphasis, I could go to the prophet and get an input from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what I should do. Then prophecy stopped. Prophecy stopped means you have to do it on your own. Okay, with help from other people and so forth and so on, but you're not going to have this fallback of getting authoritative information. Okay, so does that create uncertainty? Yes, it does. But since the Kodesh Baruch Hu is running the world, and he took away prophecy, he wants us to live with that uncertainty. Now, the idea of having a personal posek is something which everyone should have, and there are no rules whereby it determines who posek should be for an individual. If there are no rules, then you have to rely on your own judgment. You could ask people what kind of judgment to use, and I have some suggestions. And you could ask other people, and you may get other suggestions. My suggestion is to treat it the way you would treat any kind of relationship with any person for anything. I say, go to a person whom you think is a candidate to be your posek and ask him small questions. Small in size, small in difficulty, small, and see what kind of answers you get. Try them out. And you're right to express sort of certain caution. If he says something to me which I don't feel speaks my language, that may be a signal that I have to learn a new language. I had teachers like that in graduate school. I said, but what does it really mean? I said, well, figure out what my language means and then you'll know. And if you can't, then go by and drive a bus and don't get a PhD in philosophy. Part of the job is to grow, and growing may mean to learn to look at things in a different way. So, but on the way, there has to be enough reinforcement to make you feel that the investment is worth it. So if, let's say, 50% of the time, he gives you answers which demonstrate grasp of you that you didn't have of yourself, and he says to do this, you'll get that and that result is forthcoming. And then he tells you to do things which you don't understand, which don't seem to be in touch. You weigh one against the other and you say, listen, these and these times he's definitely proven himself to me, and at these times I don't see the proof. Probably is my short-sightedness. The great example of this is Avraham Avinu at the Akedah. Because when the Kodesh Baruch Hu told him to sacrifice Isaac, this went against everything he knew. And that was such a decision point. Okay, up until now, Kodesh Baruch Hu promised things for me, and he gave them to me, and the things he told me were things that I could understand and identify with, but this is totally off the page. Has he earned enough credibility in the past so that for this one, I can trust that there's a hidden meaning that I don't know? That's what I interpret it. I should say the Rambam interprets it because prophecy is self-verifying and it's impossible to doubt. So that's definitely there. But there's something else going on. There's like 60 years of consistent interaction and supernatural intervention and protection and growth and development. And now he tells them something which seems to be absolutely ruinous, destructive. At that point, it can be reasonable to say the past verification is strong enough that I can trust rationally that there's a hidden meaning here that I don't appreciate, and that would, if I knew it, it would be reasonable also.
But if God's first communication with Abraham was to do something that seemed counter to his understanding of what God was, then he wouldn't have necessarily listened?
We have to be very careful now, because how do you identify that it's God talking? It's really counter.
Rambam says it's self-verifying to a degree.
Yes, but you see, there's two different problems here. It can be self-verifying that there is a being that you're interacting with, and this being is causing you to have an experience. That's not just a dream, it's not just a hallucination. That can be self-verifying. But who says that being is God? The identity of God is tied up with certain characteristics that he has. If the interaction is such that the characteristics are called in question, then you would have a contradiction in your experience.
So
and
where
it would,
would Abraham have known those characteristics?
but he did. I told you, he had 65 years of consistent experience. He said you'll have children when it was impossible to have children. He said there will be the stone will be destroyed, and the stone was destroyed. He won a battle against 4 kings in one night. He had consistent experience.
But before then, that first time God appeared to him,
Okay, so then the question is, how far afield is it? Because Baruch Hu says to him to abandon your whole context, and you're not a young man, but he promises him, where I'm taking you to, you'll fulfill your destiny, you'll become a great nation, and so forth and so on. That sounds consistent with what God is and what God wants. Of course, it's not happening in a natural way, but if you believe in a creator, you don't believe that the world is bound by the laws of nature. So, but this is very interesting when the Ramchal talks about Gilui HaYichud. He describes it as revealing the fact that the world has only one ultimate agency, and that's the agency of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And all the things that look like they come from different agencies, like polytheism and different laws of nature and different periods of history, all of it comes from one agency. But it's not enough that there be a single agency. That single agency has to be God's agency. And you identify as God's agency by virtue of the fact that it serves a certain purpose, because that's part of the definition of God, that he operates for a certain purpose. Loving kindness. So that's got to be part of the perception.
Is moral perfection included in that perception?
Absolutely. But moral perfection is perfection of moral principles. And the application of moral principles requires knowing all the relevant moral facts. And usually we are in ignorance of the relevant moral facts. So it's very hard to test it negatively. So you take the cases where you see enough to say that it is right, and then you know. Okay, I have to go upstairs and teach.